Have you made a big, wide ambient track, but you're worried about whether it's going to translate properly to other people's stereo systems? Well, today I'm going to go in depth on mono compatibility for ambient music, why it's important, why it may not be so important for ambient music, and stick around to the end where I'll show you a few tips on how to set up your mixes so that they will always be mono compatible, but always still have that great, big, lush sound. Hey, it's Marcus from Holosuite. Mono compatibility is something that came up a lot when I was studying to mix and master, particularly for rock and pop. The mantra is that a good mix should always sound as good in mono as it does in stereo. But when I tried to apply this to my ambient mixes, I discovered very quickly that it was always a sacrifice. If I had to narrow down a mix because it was too wide, it would end up sounding too boxy and unnatural, and it would lose all its power. But when I tried to adapt this concept to ambient music, particularly when I was working on other people's mixes, I kept running into issues. If I narrowed down a mix so that it looked mono compatible on my scopes, it would end up sounding small and lifeless. But after some trial and error working on my own mixes, I think that I've found a solution that will allow you to keep that mono compatibility, but still allow you to have a big, wide mix. But why does mono compatibility even matter? Let's take a look at that next. But before we do, I'd just like to draw your attention very briefly to the links in the description. First, you'll find one that will take you to my free resources, which is an ever-growing list of guides that have been tailor-made for the needs of ambient and experimental artists. Also, there's a couple of different ways to contact me. If you're interested to see how good I can get your music to sound, you can request a free one-track master sample. Or if you'd like some assistance with your mixing or just some general advice about whether your music is ready for mastering, you can use my general contact form. All those links are in the description. Don't forget to check them out. Okay, so what is mono compatibility and why should we care? Mono compatibility just means that when you collapse your stereo mix, which is 2 channels, into mono, which is 1 channel, the mix sounds roughly the same as it does in mono as it does in stereo, which means that you're not losing any particular frequencies. Nothing's disappearing from the mix. If you've watched my video on phase before, you might understand why this happens. And if you haven't watched that video, I'll link it up in the screen right now. But for a quick refresher, things will disappear when they collapse from stereo to mono if they experience phase cancellation. The mono mix is a general indication of what it will sound like to listen when you're using speakers in a less than ideal kind of equilateral triangle situation, because it's hard to hear all of that sides area of the mix unless you're perfectly sitting in the middle of that triangle. Because the mono signal is the sum of the left and right channels, no matter where you are in relation to the speakers, you'll always be able to hear that information, but it's the other parts, the sides, that will disappear. In the case of rock and pop, phase cancellation can make a big deal for how the mix sounds because it might mean that an entire instrument disappears. For example, if the lead guitar disappears from a rock song, then most of the driving forces, that song, is also going to go away. In ambient though, the mixes are generally a lot sparser and most instruments take up more chunks of the frequency spectrum. So what we might more likely see when we collapse a big ambient mix down to mono is that instead of losing a whole instrument, we might just lose parts of instruments. So for example, if you have a very large pad that takes up most of the frequency spectrum, you might find that the bottom end might disappear in mono, but the top end might still be okay. My experience in ambient, the phase cancellation tends to happen in the low mids area. I think this may have something to do with reverb. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's just that low mids area that always seems to cause the most trouble in wide ambient mixes. So is it worth caring about? Mono compatibility obviously isn't as important as it used to be because most people are listening on headphones these days. But the steps I'm going to cover at the end of this video have really made me better at mixing. And so I think even if we're not worried too much about what it's going to sound like on speakers, I think these tips are going to be useful to help you improve your mixes and think more critically about the stereo image when you're making your music. When I started mastering ambient music, it seemed like that there was just no way around this, that there was always going to be some phase cancellation. After all, if you mess with the reverb or the width of an ambient song, it loses a lot of its power, right? And if you've got a mix that you spend a lot of time on and you run it through something like Ozone Imager and it does show that it's very wide, then it may be too far gone to save. And in that case, look, it's fine. It's not a deal breaker. You could just keep it as it is. After all, mono compatibility is only an indication of what you're going to hear in the speakers. It's just the worst case scenario. So you might get a little bit of phasing in the real world. You might lose some little parts of the mix from time to time, but really it's probably not going to make a huge difference. But what I'm about to show you will make sure that you can set up your next mix to be mono compatible from the start so that you don't have to worry about rescuing it later down the track. All right, so let's look at those steps. Number one, analyze your setup. The best place to set ourselves up for success is to check whether any of the instruments that we're using cause phase cancellation by default. If you have any instruments that output to stereo, plug them into your interface, run them through your DAW with an instance of Ozone Imager or Voxengo Corolometer. Both are free, links in the description, to see whether there's any phase cancellation by default for those instruments, and note that down. And do the same thing for any effects that you have. Just remember to run each of them in isolation so that you get a snapshot of that specific effect. Now, it's important to note that there's nothing wrong with phase cancellation happening in these situations. We just want to record which ones do naturally cause phase cancellation so we have that information as we get later down through the recording and mixing processes. Number two, analyze and tweak as you go. Once you've recorded a piece, listen to the whole thing in mono to see if anything's disappearing. If you're having trouble hearing it with just your ears, you can put on your imager or your corolometer on the mix bus to get a good view of what's happening. If something is missing, or if you can see that there's a negative phase relationship on your scope, then mute all of your tracks and then bring them back in one at a time, looking through that corolometer to see which one is causing the trouble. You can then experiment with re-recording or doing some processing until you fix that issue. For example, you might want to switch a stereo instrument to mono, or you might want to try narrowing a reverb that looks like it's gone too wide. Re-recording is generally better than using tools like Imager, but just do what works for you. So what happens if you have a reverb that is too wide, but when you narrow it, it kind of loses its life? What do you do? What I might do in that situation is to take two mono reverbs, which are slightly different from each other, put them just to the left and right of that main reverb, kind of keep it a little bit low in the mix, and that'll add a little bit more fullness without causing much phase cancellation. If that doesn't work, you could look at how everything else in the mix is panned. So if you've narrowed your reverb, if you try and narrow everything else a little bit as well, it will create that same contrast that you had in your original mix and probably create that same feeling of space again. But look, at the end of the day, if it sounds the best with that big wide panned reverb, then just use it. Really, the most important thing is that it sounds good, not whether it's perfectly in phase. And just remember that at this stage, all that matters is that the whole mix has minimal phase issues. It doesn't matter if an individual instrument is out of phase if it's not causing issues for the mix. Step 3, mix in mono. This will have the biggest positive effect by far on your mixing. Once everything's in a good spot in your mix, switch the whole mix to mono and then mix like that. You can switch back and mix in stereo later, but I find that if I do the first like 2/3 of the mix in mono, it makes everything sound so much better and better locked in place by the time I switch back to stereo. It's a lot harder work because you've got a much narrower field to mess with, but being able to lock in all those instruments in their little spots in the EQ makes it sound so much better overall. And there's something really, really satisfying when you switch back to stereo for the first time and everything just opens up for you. It just feels great every time. Okay, so I hope this clears things up. So just to reiterate, even if you don't care about how mono compatible your track is, try these tricks and I guarantee you that you will get a better sounding mix. Thanks to those of you who are still hanging around at the end here. My question for you is, do you struggle with phase? Is this an issue that you deal with? Let me know in the comments. If you haven't done it already, please do subscribe to the channel. You'll be supporting free content on ambient and experimental music. Don't forget to check the links in the description. And for those of you who'd like to go further down the phase rabbit hole, I'll link my original video on phase here as well. As always, keep making music. See you next time. Cheers.